A 4-year-old orphan boy is kicked out of the church by the priest who says you don't deserve God. But a millionaire saw everything and did something that shocked everyone. Comment. Giving a score from 0 to 10 for my story. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I count on your help. The midday sun beat mercilessly down on the dusty streets of Harmony Creek, Ohio, as the 4-year-old orphan boy, with his frail appearance that made him seem even smaller, dragged his bare feet across the hot asphalt. His torn and dirty clothes clung to his thin body, and hunger was a constant companion that had been with him for days. His empty stomach ached as much as the sores on his feet, but he kept walking until he saw the old stone church steeple at the end of Main Street. The child had learned from the elderly woman who cared for him before she passed away that the holy house was a place of refuge for those in need. With that memory warming his heart, he pushed open the heavy wooden door and entered the cool, silent space. The polished wooden pews gleamed under the colored light filtering through the stained glass windows, creating a painful contrast with his miserable appearance. The little one humbly made his way to the last pew, far from the altar, and knelt as he had seen others do, his small, dirty hands clasped together in prayer, whispering the words that his late caretaker had taught him. For a few precious moments he felt at peace, protected from the cruelties of the outside world, but the tranquility was short-lived. Heavy footsteps echoed down the center aisle, and a harsh voice cut through the sacred silence like a sharp knife. "What's a filthy beggar like you doing here?" The voice of the stern, 60-year-old Father Michael reverberated through the stone walls, loaded with contempt and indignation. The boy raised his frightened eyes, meeting the severe face of the clergyman who approached with an expression of utter revulsion. The man wore an impeccable cassock, and his grey hair was perfectly combed, but his eyes showed a coldness that contrasted with everything the child imagined about divine kindness. "Get out of here immediately," shouted the priest, pointing to the door with an accusing finger. "This is God's house, not a shelter for dirty bums. You're desecrating this sacred place with your unclean presence." The cruel words struck the child's heart like physical blows. Tears sprang to his eyes, but he tried to explain in a trembling voice, "Please, Father, I just wanted to pray like Grandma taught me." "I don't care what some crazy old woman taught you," the clergyman roared, grabbing the boy's thin arm with excessive force. "Kids like you are born to live in the gutter, and that's where you should stay. God doesn't listen to the prayers of the unwanted." Outside the church, hidden behind one of the stone pillars that supported the portico, a 30-year-old woman watched the whole scene with growing indignation. The millionaire businesswoman had arrived in Harmony Creek that morning to oversee the opening of a new branch of her company, but had decided to stop by the historic church to admire the colonial architecture. Her appearance was stunning, with features reminiscent of a movie star and elegant clothes that demonstrated her high social status. But at that moment, all her external beauty paled before the fury that grew in her chest as she witnessed such cruelty against a defenseless child. She watched the boy being practically dragged out of the church, stumbling over his own bare feet as he tried to keep his balance. The priest was still shouting threats about calling the authorities if he saw him again in the vicinity of the temple. The businesswoman discreetly followed the child through the narrow streets, keeping a safe distance so as not to be noticed. Her curiosity had turned into genuine concern when she noticed how the boy walked slowly, occasionally stopping to lean on walls or posts, clearly exhausted and malnourished. The little one crossed several blocks until he reached a more run-down area of town, where old auto repair shops shared space with abandoned warehouses. Then he disappeared between two buildings, slipping through a narrow opening in a wire fence. The millionaire waited a few minutes before approaching and discovering that there was a small shed in the back of an auto repair shop. The place was clearly abandoned for years, with broken tiles and peeling walls. Through a crack in the wooden wall, she managed to glimpse the interior, and her heart broke. The boy had created a small refuge amidst the rubble and rusty tools. Some dirty rags served as a bed, and plastic bottles held dirty water collected from the rain. In a corner, scraps of rotten food revealed how he survived, rummaging through garbage cans and feeding on leftovers that others had discarded. The child curled up in a fetal position on the rags, hugging his knees while sobbing softly. His tears mixed with the dirt on his face, creating clean streaks on his dirty cheeks. He murmured between sobs, "Why doesn't God like me, Grandma? What did I do wrong?" The businesswoman felt her own tears burning her eyes. All her fortune, accumulated through smart investments in stock market shares and investments in various funds, seemed insignificant in the face of that abandoned child who didn't even know the concept of a complete meal. At that moment, a steely determination took over her heart. She couldn't simply ignore that situation and go on with her privileged life. Something had to be done, and she had both the resources and the will to act. But as she watched the boy finally fall asleep from exhaustion on the dirty rags, a disturbing question echoed in her mind. How many other children in that city suffered in silence, invisible to a society that preferred not to see their pain? During the following days, the millionaire businesswoman couldn't get the image of the orphan boy out of her mind. While attending important meetings about her company's investments and reviewing reports on the profitability of her assets, her thoughts constantly returned to that abandoned child sleeping on dirty rags in a dilapidated shed. On the third night, after the encounter at the church, she made a decision that would change everything. Discreetly, without revealing her identity to anyone, she began to leave small gifts in the boy's makeshift refuge. Always during the early hours of the morning, when the streets were deserted, she carefully placed packages with nutritious food, clean water, and a few pieces of children's clothing that she had bought during the day. The first morning that the little one found the mysterious gifts was a moment of pure disbelief. He examined each item with wide eyes, gently touching the fresh bread and fruit, as if they were precious treasures. His trembling hands unwrapped a clean t-shirt, and for the first time in months, he smiled genuinely. "Grandma said God takes care of those who pray from the heart," he murmured to himself, hugging the new clothes against his thin chest. She was right. In the following days, the pattern was repeated. The businesswoman watched from afar during the day, making sure that no one else discovered the child's hiding place, and returned in the early hours of the morning to leave new supplies. The boy, in turn, began to gain a little weight, and his strength slowly returned. Moved by gratitude and the belief that he was receiving divine blessings, the little one decided to return to the church to thank properly. Wearing one of the clean t-shirts he had found, he walked determinedly to the stone temple, ignoring the contemptuous looks of passers-by who still recognized him as the beggar boy. This time, he was careful to enter when the church was empty, or so he thought. He knelt on the same back pew and began to whisper a prayer of gratitude, thanking for the miracles he was receiving and asking for protection for the kind person who was helping him anonymously. But fate seemed to conspire against him. The heavy and familiar footsteps echoed again through the aisle, and the harsh voice of the 60-year-old priest cut through the silence with even more venom than the first time. "I can't believe you had the audacity to come back here." The clergyman approached, with his face contorted in anger, his hands clenched into fists. "I warned you that dirty beggars are not welcome in the house of God." The boy tried to explain that he was now clean and only wanted to thank, but his words were stifled by a violent slap that knocked him off the pew. The force of the blow made his cheek burn, and his eyes filled with tears not only of pain, but of deep confusion. "You think some stolen clothes are going to change what you are?" shouted the priest, pointing accusingly. "Once trash, always trash. And now you're also a thief. Where did you get those clothes, you filthy brat?" The accusation of theft struck the child's heart like a stab. He had never stolen anything in his life, surviving only on the scraps he found discarded. His tears fell abundantly as he tried to explain about the mysterious gifts, but the clergyman refused to listen to a single word. Outside the church, the millionaire businesswoman had just arrived for her daily observation visit when she heard the shouts coming from inside. Her blood boiled as she recognized the priest's cruel voice and the desperate sobs of the child she had set out to help secretly. This time, she didn't stay hidden. Pushing the church doors open forcefully, she entered determinedly and found the boy lying on the floor, cowering in fear as the priest prepared to kick him. "Stop immediately!" Her voice echoed through the church with an authority that made the clergyman jump. The woman's stunning beauty and her clearly expensive clothes made the priest automatically assume a more respectful posture, although he still maintained his severe expression. "Madam, don't interfere in this matter," said the priest, trying to soften his tone. "This boy is a known vagrant who disturbs our Christian community. I'm just maintaining order in our sacred temple." The businesswoman approached the boy and helped him up gently, noticing the red mark on his cheek where he had been struck. Her fury grew even more as she saw firsthand the violence that had been perpetrated against a defenseless child. Maintain order by hitting a 4-year-old child? Her voice was icy, loaded with an intensity that made the priest take a step back. "What kind of man of God do you think you are?" The clergyman tried to justify himself, claiming that he was protecting the sanctity of the sacred place. But the millionaire was not convinced. She knew hypocrites when she saw them, having dealt with many throughout her successful business career. "This boy has more purity in his heart than you have in your entire body," she declared, keeping the child protected behind her. "And if I find out that you've laid hands on him again, you'll have to answer for it." The priest, realizing that he was facing someone with resources and influence, quickly changed his strategy. He assumed a falsely humble posture and tried to explain that he was only following the church's rules about beggars and vagrants, but his eyes betrayed the hatred he felt for being confronted publicly. The businesswoman escorted the boy out of the church, but as they walked, she noticed something disturbing in the clergyman's behavior. He showed no genuine remorse or concern for the child's well-being. Instead, his calculating eyes followed her to the exit, as if he were planning some kind of retaliation. Later that day, while the millionaire was overseeing a meeting about the profits from her financial investments, she couldn't focus on the impressive numbers that her investments in real estate funds had generated. Her mind was occupied with a growing suspicion that there was something deeply wrong with that priest, something that went far beyond simple social intolerance. That night, while leaving the usual supplies for the boy, she made a decision that would change the course of the whole situation. It was time to investigate more deeply who that authoritarian clergyman really was, and find out if her suspicions about his true nature were correct. But what she didn't know was that the priest had already begun his own investigation into her, and the consequences of this silent war were about to explode in ways that neither of them could imagine. The millionaire businesswoman's investigation began discreetly, using the same methods she had learned over years building her financial empire through careful analysis and rigorous vetting. She hired a private investigator from the next town over, an experienced man who wouldn't raise suspicion in the small, conservative community. Meanwhile, the authoritarian priest had begun his own smear campaign. During Sunday sermons, he began to make subtle references to evil influences, trying to corrupt the town's traditional values. His carefully chosen words planted seeds of distrust in the minds of the most conservative faithful. "We must be vigilant against those who come from outside with their ill-gotten fortunes," he proclaimed from the pulpit, his words echoing through the stone walls. "People who feign kindness but really want to destroy our sacred customs." Rumors began to spread like wildfire. The businesswoman, who had arrived in Harmony Creek with legitimate business purposes, found herself being watched with increasing hostility by the locals. Whispered comments followed her through the streets, and some shopkeepers began to treat her with inexplicable coldness. The orphan boy, oblivious to the political tensions that were developing around him, continued to receive the mysterious gifts that allowed him to survive with dignity. His strength had returned significantly, and he had even managed to find some occasional jobs helping vendors at the local farmers' market in exchange for a few coins. But the child's happiness was brutally interrupted when a group of locals, influenced by the priest's poisonous words, discovered his hiding place. Led by a fanatical merchant who assiduously attended Mass, they raided the abandoned shed during a sweltering afternoon. "Here's the little demon's lair," shouted the merchant, pointing to the child's few organized belongings. "Look at all this stolen stuff. I knew he was being used by evil forces." The boy arrived at his makeshift refuge, only to find his few belongings being systematically destroyed. The clean clothes were torn, the food was trampled, and even the bottles of water were smashed against the deteriorating walls. "Please stop," pleaded the child, trying to save at least one T-shirt from the wreckage. "I didn't steal anything. Someone kind gave me these things." But his words fell on deaf ears. The group was convinced that they were doing a sacred service, cleansing their town of the corrupting influence that the priest had described in his fiery sermons. When the millionaire arrived that night to leave the usual supplies, she found only rubble and wreckage where the child's small makeshift home had once been. Her heart ached as she imagined the despair that the boy must be feeling at that moment. She spent hours searching for the child in the dark streets, discreetly asking the few locals who still showed sympathy. Finally, an elderly fruit vendor whispered that he had seen a small boy sleeping under a bridge on the outskirts of town, shivering with cold and crying softly. Upon finding the little one huddled under the concrete structure, wearing only a torn T-shirt and dirty pants, the businesswoman felt an anger that burned more intensely than any emotion she had ever experienced. The dry tears on the child's cheeks told a story of abandonment and despair that broke her heart. "My angel," she whispered softly, kneeling next to the boy, who woke up startled. "You don't have to go through this alone anymore." But when she tried to offer direct shelter, she found that the situation had become much more complicated. The investigator she had hired brought disturbing information about the extent of the priest's influence in the local community. "Madam, this man controls practically every aspect of social life in this town," explained the investigator during a secret meeting in a cafe in the next town over. "He has political connections, influence over the main merchants, and most families depend on his approval to keep their businesses running." The findings were even more shocking. The clergyman had built a true empire of power based on psychological manipulation and emotional blackmail. Entire families lived in fear of challenging his opinions, as that would mean social ostracism and financial ruin. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. The investigator had discovered suspicious financial records related to church donations. Substantial amounts of money that should have been allocated to charity work were being diverted to the priest's personal accounts. "He's building a luxurious mansion on the outskirts of town," revealed the investigator, showing secret photographs of the construction. "The project costs a fortune, much more than any religious salary could afford. All this money is coming from the donations of the faithful." The millionaire studied the evidence with the same intensity she used to analyze reports on her investments in stocks and funds. Each document represented a piece of a puzzle of corruption that extended far beyond what she had initially imagined. Meanwhile, the orphan boy had disappeared again. Terrified by the traumatic events and without understanding why people had turned against him, the child had hidden somewhere even more remote in the town. The businesswoman intensified her search efforts, but found that the rumors spread by the priest had created an atmosphere of paranoia where no one wanted to be seen helping her. Shopkeepers who had previously treated her with professional respect now closed their doors when she approached. The situation reached a critical point when she discovered through an anonymous source that the boy had been found unconscious near the river that ran through the town. Severe malnutrition and exposure to the cold night air had taken their toll on his already fragile little body. Without hesitating, she broke all the discretion protocols she had maintained until then. She went directly to the place where the child had been taken, determined to ensure that he received adequate medical care, regardless of the social consequences that this might entail. But when she arrived at the small medical center in the town, she discovered that the priest had already arrived before her. The priest was talking intensely with the local doctor, and their facial expressions suggested that some kind of deal was being negotiated. The tension in the air was palpable when she entered the waiting room. The priest's eyes met hers, and for the first time both stared at each other as declared adversaries, each knowing that a silent war had officially begun. The fate of the orphan boy now depended on who would prove to be more determined in this battle between genuine wealth used for good and false piety, masking absolute corruption. The silent confrontation in the medical center lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for both to understand that there was no more room for subtleties. The priest, realizing that his influence over the local doctor might not be enough in the face of the millionaire's determination, decided to play his most dangerous card. "Doctor, this woman is a disturber of the public order," declared the priest in a solemn voice, assuming his most authoritative posture. "She has been using this poor boy as a pawn in her schemes to destabilize our Christian community." The businesswoman felt her blood boil, but she maintained her composure. Her years of building an empire based on strategic negotiations had taught her the importance of staying calm even under extreme pressure. "Doctor," she replied in a firm voice, "this boy is malnourished and seriously ill. The only thing that matters now is saving his life. I will take responsibility for all necessary medical costs." The doctor, a middle-aged man clearly uncomfortable with the tension between the two powerful figures, tried to mediate the situation. But when he examined the unconscious child, his expression became deeply concerned. "His condition is critical," he murmured, checking the frail vital signs. "Severe malnutrition, advanced dehydration, and signs of pneumonia. He needs to be transferred immediately to the hospital in the next town." The priest tried to intervene, claiming that the church could provide the necessary care through traditional methods, but the millionaire didn't allow the conversation to continue. Using her financial authority, she organized emergency medical transport and personally accompanied the child throughout the agonizing journey. During the 3 days that the boy remained in critical condition in the intensive care unit, the businesswoman did not leave the hospital. She used this time to continue her investigation, now with access to more sophisticated resources from the larger city. It was during one of those nights of vigil that an elderly 60-year-old nurse, touched by the woman's dedication, approached with a revelation that would change everything. "Ma'am, I recognize this boy," whispered the nurse, looking fondly at the child who was finally beginning to show signs of improvement. "He's the grandson of Mrs. Eleanor, who worked for over 20 years at the textile mill. A wonderful woman with a pure heart." The millionaire felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. The textile mill had been her first company, acquired when she was still building her wealth through careful investments in shares of promising small businesses. Mrs. Eleanor spoke a lot about the kind boss who always treated employees with dignity, continued the nurse, her words filled with emotion. "She said that you were different from other wealthy business owners, that you really cared about ordinary people." Memories came back like an avalanche. The businesswoman clearly remembered Mrs. Eleanor, a woman of frail appearance but strong spirit, who worked with tireless dedication and always had a gentle smile for everyone. She had passed away a few years earlier, and the millionaire had personally ensured that her family received a lifetime pension. "But what happened to her family?" she asked, her voice trembling with contained emotion. The nurse explained that Mrs. Eleanor had taken care of her grandson after the child's parents perished in a car accident. She had used every penny of the pension to ensure that the boy had food and clothing, but when her health began to decline, she could no longer work or care for the child adequately. "She passed away 6 months ago," whispered the nurse, wiping away a tear. Her last days were tormented by worry about her grandson's future. She begged anyone who would listen to take care of the little one, but the extended family was too poor to assume the responsibility. The revelation struck the millionaire like lightning. All this time, she had been helping the grandson of one of the most beloved employees of her first company, a woman who had contributed significantly to the initial success of her business. "Fate has its mysterious ways of connecting people," she murmured to herself, looking at the serene face of the child, who was finally sleeping peacefully under proper medical care. But while this touching revelation unfolded in the hospital, the priest had dramatically intensified his campaign in Harmony Creek. Taking advantage of the businesswoman's absence, he organized community meetings where he spread increasingly elaborate lies about her intentions. "This woman is using dirty money from big corporations to corrupt our children," he shouted to growing crowds of frightened residents. "She wants to turn our peaceful town into a center of moral depravity." Protests began to form in front of the millionaire's company branch. Signs with hostile messages were placed in the windows, and some local employees began to receive threats from customers manipulated by the clergyman's inflammatory words. The situation deteriorated rapidly when several important contracts were cancelled by companies that did not want to be associated with the controversy surrounding the millionaire. Her wealth, carefully built through decades of hard work and smart investments, began to suffer significant losses, but the last straw came when she returned to Harmony Creek with the boy finally recovered. They were greeted by a hostile crowd at the city limits, led by the priest himself, who brandished a cross as if it were a weapon. "Get out of our holy town!" shouted the crowd, repeating the poisonous words that had been planted in their minds. "We don't want your corruption here." The boy, still frail from the recent illness, clung to the businesswoman's hand with terror in his eyes. He didn't understand why the same people who had previously simply ignored him now looked at him with open hatred. "Why are they angry at us?" whispered the child, his voice breaking with fear and confusion. The millionaire felt her heart break. All her wealth, all her investments in high-yield funds, all her profits accumulated over the years seemed useless in the face of the pain of an innocent child being rejected by an entire community. In that moment of absolute despair, when it seemed that all forces were against them, she made the riskiest decision of her life. It was time to lay all her cards on the table and expose the truth about the corrupt priest, even if it cost her everything she had built. But first, she needed to ensure the boy's safety, and that's when she realized that the private investigator had left an urgent message on her phone. The final evidence on the clergyman's corruption had been found, and it was even more devastating than she had imagined. The final battle was about to begin, and the fate of all would depend on who could convince the community about where the truth really lay. If you liked this wonderful story, please comment giving a score from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important. And if you love beautiful stories, subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos.